April 1944, about 900 China-Burma, Burma. The morning mist had barely burned off the jungle canopy when the first shells whistled in. For the men of the 2nd Battalion, 5307th Composite Unit, better known to the world as Merrill's Marauders, the sound was sickeningly familiar. They were dug into a hilltop perimeter, surrounded by the Japanese 18th Division, cut off from help and running low on water. But for the animals tethered on the exposed picket lines, the sound meant panic. At the center of the defensive perimeter where the ground was flattest stood the unit's lifeline, the mules. When the Japanese artillery and mortar barrages began, the men could dive into foxholes. They could press their bodies into the red clay and pray the shrapnel flew high. The mules had no such luxury. They stood tied to trees or picket ropes, large, terrified silhouettes against the green foliage. As the 75 shells impacted, the earth shook. Shrapnel tore through the brush. The braying of wounded animals cut through the thunder of explosions, a sound that unnerved even the most hardened combat veterans. These weren't just beasts of burden. They were the only reason the Marauders were able to fight this deep in enemy territory. They carried the radios, the ammunition, the medical supplies, and the heavy weaponry. Now they were being slaughtered. By the time the smoke cleared from this morning barrage, the toll was evident. The Marauders had brought approximately 200 mules into the perimeter at China-Burma before the siege would lift. 75 of them would lie dead, victims of Japanese marksmanship and the indiscriminate violence of indirect fire. The stench of the carcasses, baking in the tropical heat within the claustrophobic confines of the perimeter, became a psychological weapon in its own right. It was the smell of a logistical system breaking down under fire. To understand why American soldiers were dying to protect mules in the forgotten corners of Southeast Asia, one must look at the map of the China-Burma-India theater. This was the end of the line. It was a war fought where the map turned blank, a place where the mechanized might of the United States Army ground to a halt. The deuce-and-a-half trucks, the jeeps, and the tanks that were sweeping across Europe and the Pacific Islands were useless here. The terrain was a nightmare of vertical jungle, razor-backed ridges, and rivers that swelled into raging torrents during the monsoon. In 1944, the mission was to reopen the land route to China, to break the Japanese blockade and keep China in the war. To do that, Allied forces had to push through northern Burma. General Joseph Stilwell, the theater commander, knew the geography better than anyone. He had walked out of Burma in May 1942, leading a retreat on foot at a pace of 105 steps per minute, the Stilwell stride, when the Allied defense first collapsed. He knew that in the jungle, the road doesn't go to the war goes where there are no roads. This necessitated a return to a primitive form of warfare, one that looked more like the campaigns of the 19th century than the mechanized blitzkrieg of the 20th. The solution was the mule. Specifically, the Missouri mule, large, sure-footed, and obstinate. These animals were high-value military assets, procured in the United States for roughly $200 a head, but by the time they were shipped 14,000 miles to India, acclimated and trained, their intrinsic value to the Army was estimated at $5,000 each. In the jungle, they were priceless. When the 5307th was formed in August 1943, it was designed as a long-range penetration unit. They were light infantry, intended to move fast and hit hard behind enemy lines. But light is a relative term. A soldier can only carry so much on his back before he becomes combat ineffective. To sustain a force of nearly 3,000 men in the wilderness, they needed a supply train that could follow them up 60-degree inclines. The unit was organized with 700 pack animals. The logistics of the pack train were a science unto themselves. The primary burden was the 75 pack howitzer. This artillery piece was the Marauders' heavy punch, capable of dislodging Japanese bunkers that small arms couldn't scratch. But you couldn't tow a howitzer through the bamboo. Instead, the gun was designed to be broken down into component parts. It took 7 mules to carry a single gun, one for the tube, one for the breech, one for the wheels, and so on, plus the animals needed to haul the ammunition. If the mule carrying the breech mechanism slid off a cliff, the gun was useless. The entire firepower of the battalion relied on the footing of these animals. The men assigned to handle them, the mule skinners, were rarely specialists by trade. In the urgency to assemble the unit, the army didn't have time to find hundreds of experienced farmhands or cavalrymen. They took volunteers from jungle warfare training centers, infantry units, and administrative posts. General Frank Merrill, the unit's commander, famously quipped about the training disparity. "Next time," he said, "give me mule skinners and I'll make doughboys out of them instead of trying to turn doughboys into mule skinners." It was a steep learning curve. A soldier from the Bronx or Chicago who had never seen a mule outside of a moving picture was suddenly responsible for an animal that weighed half a ton and had a mind of its own. They had to learn the diamond hitch to secure the Phillips pack saddles. They had to learn to check hooves for stone bruises and rot. They had to learn that a mule would work until it dropped, but it wouldn't tolerate abuse. The bond that formed between the Skinners and their animals was forged in the misery of the Yukon Valley in February 1944. As the Marauders began their long-range penetration mission, the trails proved to be treacherous beyond expectation. The paths were narrow, slick with mud, and infested with leeches. The mules carried packs weighing 200 pounds or more, ammunition, rations, and medical supplies. In the steep, jagged ridges of the Kumon Range, the trails were often little more than game tracks widened by machete. When the rains came, these paths turned into chutes of slick mud. A mule is sure-footed, perhaps the most sure-footed animal in the Army's inventory, but even a Missouri mule cannot defy physics. In the Yukon Valley, the Skinners faced gradients so severe that the animals simply could not find purchase. The mud was deep, the incline nearly vertical. Here, the doughboy-turned-Skinner faced his hardest test. It wasn't enough to lead the animal, he had to serve it. When a mule balked at a slick rise, the Skinners couldn't simply whip them forward. That would only result in a tumbled animal and a broken leg. Instead, the men had to halt the column, unlash the diamond hitches, and strip the packs. Soldiers, already exhausted from the march and riddled with dysentery, hoisted the 200-pound loads onto their own backs. They clawed their way up the muddy slopes, hand over hand, grabbing roots and vines, ferrying the cargo to the crest. Then they slid back down to retrieve the animals. A mule, unburdened, could scramble up the bank like a goat. At the top, the Skinners would reload, retighten the cinches, and move another 100 yards before the process had to be repeated. It was backbreaking labor that dissolved the barrier between man and beast. You didn't look at a mule as equipment when you were sweating alongside it. You looked at it as a partner in misery. This bond made the events at NH-Pum-Ga in April all the more harrowing. As the siege wore on, the perimeter shrank. The Japanese 18th Division had the high ground and the heavy mortars. The Marauders were trapped in a bowl, and the mules were in the center of the kill zone. The loss of 75 animals was a tactical disaster, stripping the unit of its mobility, but for the men in the foxholes, it was a visceral horror. Water was rationed to the drop. The nearest water hole had been captured by the Japanese, leaving the Marauders dependent on airdrops. There wasn't enough for the men, let alone the livestock. The mules began to wither from dehydration, their ribs showing through their dusty coats. When the mortar rounds landed, the shrapnel flayed them. In a normal engagement, a wounded animal would be euthanized immediately, a mercy bullet to the brain. But NH-Pum-Ga was not a normal engagement. The perimeter was so tight, and the heat so oppressive, that the smell of the decomposing carcasses already littered around the bivouac was nearly incapacitating. The soldiers, gagging on the stench of death that hung heavy in the humid air, were reluctant to shoot the wounded survivors. They feared that adding more carcasses to the pile would make the position physically uninhabitable. So the wounded animals stood and suffered, their distress calls echoing through the night, keeping men awake who were already on the brink of collapse. It was a grim testament to the brutality of the theater. Logistics had a heartbeat, and it bled. By the time the siege was broken and the Marauders moved on to capture the Myitkyina airfield in May, the unit was a shell of its former self. Disease, Exhaustion and combat had whittled the 5,307th down to a fraction of its strength. Of the nearly 3,000 men who had marched into Burma, only about 200 were left standing for the final push. The mules had fared no better. But the concept had been proven. The only way to move an army through the Burmese jungle was on four legs. As the Marauders faded into history, a new force stepped into the breach in the summer and fall of 1944. The 5,332nd Brigade Provisional, known as the Mars Task Force. If the Marauders were the experiment, the Mars Task Force was the industrial application. They arrived with more firepower, more men, and significantly more mules, approximately 3,000 of them. The Mars Task Force was tasked with finishing what Stilwell had started, securing the Lido Road and linking up with the Burma Road to open the floodgates of supply to China. To do this, they had to navigate the Trace, a path through the wilderness that existed more on maps than in reality. In January 1945, the 475th Infantry and the field artillery units of the Mars Task Force pushed south. The weather, which had been an enemy to the Marauders, turned catastrophic for the Mars men. The Christmas monsoons arrived with a vengeance. The trails, carved into the sides of mountains, dissolved. For the mule skinners of the 612th and 613th Field Artillery, the march became a high-wire act without a net. They were moving 75 MPAC howitzers, ammunition, and heavy camp equipment. The trail was often no wider than the mule itself, with a sheer drop of hundreds of feet on one side and a vertical rock face on the other. The rain was relentless, turning the clay into a substance with the consistency of axle grease. It was here that the training and the peculiar genius of the mule were tested to the limit. A horse, when it loses its footing, tends to panic, thrashing about and often throwing itself off the ledge. A mule is different. When a mule slips, it freezes. It lowers its center of gravity and waits. However, the mud of January 1945 cared little for instinct. There were moments when the ground simply gave way. Men watched in horror as mules, laden with howitzer tubes or radio sets, slid silently off the edge of the trail, tumbling end over end into the jungle canopy below. Remarkably, this was not always a death sentence. The resilience of these animals became legendary among the task force. Skinners would rappel down the ravines, expecting to find a broken carcass, only to find the mule bruised, shaken, and grazing on bamboo shoots, the load still lashed to the Phillips saddle. If the animal could stand, they would cut a new path, switchback by switchback, and lead it back up to the column. Despite the treacherous conditions and the sheer number of animals, the Mars Task Force completed its movement with minimal loss of critical supplies. They arrived at the Burma Road with their artillery intact, a feat that motorized transport could never have accomplished. Behind this massive movement of livestock was a sophisticated, albeit rustic, medical support system. The Army Veterinary Corps, specifically units like the 18th Veterinary Evacuation Hospital, operated in conditions that would have appalled a stateside practitioner. Colonel R.W. Maury and his staff were the unsung heroes of the logistical war. They weren't just treating shrapnel wounds and broken bones. They were the guardians of the Army's mobility, battling a host of tropical diseases that could wipe out a pack train faster than a Japanese ambush. Under the command of officers like Colonel Maury, the 18th Veterinary Evacuation Hospital became a mobile trauma center for the four-legged soldier. They dealt with exhaustion, heat stroke, and the relentless rot of the jungle floor that ate away at hooves. In a theater where a single lame mule meant leaving a radio or a crate of 75 shells behind in the mud, their work was as critical as that of the riflemen on the perimeter. By January 1945, the Mars Task Force had fully engaged the reality of the terrain. The 3,000 mules assigned to the task force were not merely baggage carriers. They were the structural integrity of the 5,332nd Brigade. As the 475th Infantry and the supporting artillery units pushed toward the Burma Road, the reliance on these animals became absolute. The trails were often so steep that the mules, burdened with the heavy steel of the pack howitzers, had to be essentially pushed, and pulled up the inclines by men who were themselves gasping for air in the thin mountain atmosphere. It was during this push that the bond between the American soldier and the Missouri mule solidified into something legendary. The men of the 612th and 613th Field Artillery, PAC, lived in a symbiotic rhythm with their animals. They shared their water rations. They shared the misery of the leeches. When the trails narrowed to a terrifying ribbon of slick clay, it was the mule's judgment that the skinner trusted over his own. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a column when a mule goes over the side. In the deep ravines of the Shweli River Valley, the Mars task force lost animals to the sheer geometry of the landscape. A misstep on a crumbling ledge, a shift in the 200-pound load, and the animal would simply disappear into the green void below. But the resilience of the breed was often shocking. Reports from the 612th describe skinners scrambling down hundreds of feet of near-vertical slope to retrieve a fallen animal, fully expecting to find a corpse, only to discover the mule standing in the brush, shaken but unbroken, waiting for orders. If the legs were sound, the load was relashed, a new path was cut with machetes, and the animal was coaxed back up to the war. This relentless forward momentum, driven by hooves and sheer stubbornness, eventually paid off. The Mars task force broke through. They cut the Japanese supply lines and linked up with the Burma Road. But as the combat phase in Burma began to wind down in the spring of 1945, the army faced a new logistical challenge. The war in China was still raging, and the Chinese Nationalist Army was desperate for the very mobility that had carried the Americans through the jungle. In May 1945, one of the most extraordinary logistical feats of the entire theater began. It wasn't a combat patrol, but a migration. The order came down to move the pack animals, veterans of the Myitkyina and Mars campaigns, along with fresh remounts, from northern Burma into China proper. The destination was Kunming, the vital hub of Allied operations in China. The scale of this movement was biblical. Over 5,000 mules and horses were assembled for the drive. It was a convoy of flesh and bone that stretched for miles along the newly opened roads and ancient tracks. The 18th Veterinary Evacuation Hospital accompanied the column, their work shifting from combat triage to the preventative maintenance of a massive herd on the move. The journey to Kunming was an ordeal of endurance. The route followed the scars of the Lido and Burma roads, winding through mountain passes that scraped the clouds. The dust kicked up by 20,000 hooves coated the lungs of the men and animals alike. For the veterinary staff, it was a rolling crisis management operation. They monitored the animals for signs of glanders and sura, infectious diseases that could turn the convoy into a graveyard. They managed the feed and water for a population the size of a small town, all while moving through territory that had only recently been cleared of the enemy. Embedded in this river of livestock were individual stories of survival that defied the odds. Among the thousands of animals plodding toward Kunming was a mule known to the troops as Molly. To the casual observer, she was just another dusty, brown beast of burden, indistinguishable from the thousands of others swishing flies with their tails. But to the men who had served with her, Molly was a living history of the Burma campaign. Molly was a veteran in the truest sense of the word. She had trekked the entire breadth of the theater. She had survived the starvation rations of the early sieges. She had endured the terrifying mortar barrages that had decimated the herds at Nhpumga. By the time she stepped onto the road to Kunming in August 1945, Molly had been wounded 8 separate times. She bore the scars of Japanese shrapnel and the rough surgery of the field vets. Her journey was a testament to the durability of the American mule. She had been foaled in the pastures of Missouri, purchased by the Quartermaster Corps, shipped across the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, a voyage of some 14,000 miles, and then marched into the most inhospitable jungle on Earth. She had carried the guns that killed the enemy, the radios that called in the airstrikes, and the food that kept the riflemen alive. Now, with the war in the Pacific reaching its atomic crescendo, she was walking the final leg of her service. The arrival of the convoy in Kunming in August 1945 marked the end of an era for the American mule skinner. The war was ending. The great machinery of the U.S. Army was preparing to pivot home, but for the mules, there would be no victory parade down Fifth Avenue. There would be no GI Bill. The orders were clear. The animals were to be turned over to the Chinese army. The transfer was a pragmatic military necessity. China had been bled dry by years of war with Japan. They needed the transport capacity to rebuild and to continue their own internal struggles. But for the American soldiers who had walked beside these animals for hundreds of miles, who had slept curled up against their flanks for warmth in the monsoon rains, the handover was a bitter moment. Technical Sergeant Edward Rock Jr., a veteran of the theater and thousands like him, had to say goodbye to the partners that had saved their lives. The bond that General Merrill had joked about, the transformation of doughboys into mule skinners, had become a profound reality. These men knew that without the mules, the campaigns in northern Burma would have been impossible. The trucks, the deuce and a halves, the jeeps, they had all failed where the mule had succeeded. In the dusty corrals of Kunming, the halters were handed over. The brands were checked one last time. The 18th Veterinary Evacuation Hospital signed off on the health of the herd. The mules, including the 8-time wounded Molly, were absorbed into the ranks of the Chinese forces. They would likely work until they died, far from the green pastures of the Midwest where they had been born. The legacy of that exchange in the red clay of Kunming was bitter. It was a transaction of necessity, devoid of the sentimentality that had kept men and animals alive through the monsoons. The American soldier was going home to a ticker-tape parade, or at least a quiet life in a rapidly modernizing nation. The American mule was staying behind, destined to serve in the brutal civil conflict already brewing between the nationalists and the communists. For the men of the Mars Task Force and the remnants of the Marauders, leaving the mules was akin to leaving a platoon mate in the field. These animals were not merely government property with a serial number branded on the neck. They were the reason the men were still breathing. In the final accounting of the China-Burma-India theater, the statistics were staggering. A single mule, by the time it reached the front lines in Burma, represented an investment of nearly $5,000, a small fortune in 1945. That cost factored in the purchase price in the American Midwest, the rail transport to the coast, the ship passage across the Atlantic and around the Cape of Good Hope to India, and finally, the trek into the jungle. It was a logistical pipeline that spanned 14,000 miles, but the value of the animal could not be measured in dollars. It was measured in the 75 MPAC howitzers that broke the Japanese bunkers at Wallobum and Myitkyina. The math of jungle warfare was simple. A 75 mm howitzer could not be carried by men. It was too heavy. It could not be moved by jeep. The terrain was too dense. It had to be broken down into 7 distinct loads: the tube, the breech, the wheels, the trail, and the ammunition. 7 mules moving in a precise, disciplined line were required to bring a single gun into action. If one mule was lost, if the animal carrying the breech mechanism slid off a cliff or took a sniper round, the gun was useless. The interdependence was absolute. This reality forced a level of care that was unique in the annals of the U.S. Army. The Japanese forces in Burma also used pack animals, thousands of horses and mules commandeered from occupied territories. But the Japanese approach was one of expendability. They drove their animals until they collapsed from starvation or sura, leaving a trail of bones that Allied scouts often used to track their movements. The Americans, conversely, built a medical infrastructure for their 4-legged soldiers that rivaled the care given to the infantry. Colonel R.W. Maury and the veterinarians of the 18th Veterinary Evacuation Hospital were the architects of this survival. They understood that in the tropics, a minor abrasion from an ill-fitting saddle could turn into a maggot-infested wound within hours. They fought a constant war against the environment. The humidity rot the leather of the Phillips cargo saddles. It softened the hooves until they were prone to bruising on the sharp limestone of the mountain trails. The vets established aid stations in the middle of the bamboo thickets, performing surgeries under flashlight while the perimeter guards watched for infiltrators. They treated the animals for exhaustion, for screwworm, and for the concussive effects of nearby artillery blasts. The survival rate of the American mules was not an accident. It was a triumph of veterinary science applied in the most primitive conditions imaginable. When the Mars Task Force moved those 3,000 animals through the Christmas monsoons of 1944 and into early 1945, the fact that they arrived with the herd largely intact was a logistical miracle that stunned the British and Chinese observers. It proved that the soft American approach, heavy feeding, regular medical checks, and the refusal to overload the animals beyond the 200-pound limit was actually the most pragmatic strategy of the war. Yet, as the war wound down, the sheer anachronism of the campaign became clear. The United States had ended the war with the atomic bomb, a weapon of terrifying modernity dropped from a B-29 superfortress, a marvel of aeronautical engineering. And yet on the ground in Burma, victory had been secured by the same technology used by the Roman legions, the pack animal. The juxtaposition was jarring. The most industrialized nation on earth had been forced to relearn the ancient rhythms of the trail. General Joseph Stilwell, the theater commander, understood this duality better than anyone. In May 1942, during the catastrophic Allied collapse, Stilwell had been forced to walk out of Burma. He led a group of 114 people on a trek to India, setting a brutal pace of 105 steps per minute, the famous Stilwell stride. That retreat was a humiliation, a testament to the failure of modern transport in the face of the jungle. When the Americans returned 2 years later, first with Merrill's Marauders and then with the Mars Task Force, they did not come in trucks. They came walking, leading mules. They had accepted the terms of the battlefield. For the mule skinners, the men who actually held the lead ropes, the end of the war brought a complex grief. These were men like Irvin Matthijs, who had learned to read the twitch of a mule's ear as a warning of danger. They were men who had slept with their heads resting on a grain sack, listening to the steady chewing of the animals in the picket line. They knew the personalities of their charges. Some mules were stoic, others were skittish. Some would only eat if hand-fed. Some, like the veteran Molly, seemed to possess a weary wisdom, plodding forward when younger animals balked at the sound of gunfire. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but widely circulated among the veterans of the 612th Field Artillery, about the final days in Kunming. A young skinner from Texas, tasked with turning over his string of 3 mules to a Chinese sergeant, spent an hour grooming them one last time. He cleaned their hooves, brushed the mud from their flanks, and checked the fit of the halters. He tried to explain to the Chinese soldier, through hand gestures and broken phrases, that the lead mule was shy of water and needed to be coaxed to drink. The Chinese soldier nodded, likely not understanding a word, and took the ropes. The American watched them walk away, disappearing into the chaotic mass of the nationalist army, and then sat down in the dust and wept. It wasn't just about the animal. It was about the sudden severance of a partnership that had defined his existence for 2 years. The War Department had calculated that bringing the animals back to the United States was economically unfeasible. The shipping tonnage was needed for men and equipment. The risk of introducing exotic Asian diseases to the American equine population was deemed too high. So the order stood. The mules stayed. In the decades that followed, the story of the CBI mules faded into the background of World War II history. The popular imagination was captured by the paratroopers in Europe or the Marines on the beaches of the Pacific. The image of a soldier leading a mule through a bamboo tunnel didn't fit the narrative of a mechanized superpower. But for the men who had survived the long trek, the mule was not merely a beast of burden. It was the difference between living and dying in a theater where the jungle itself was a more formidable enemy than the Japanese. To understand the tears shed in the dust of Kunming, one must look back to where the bond was forged, in the mud of the Hukong Valley and the terrifying claustrophobia of Nhpumga. The relationship between the American soldier and the American mule in Burma began in earnest with the formation of the 5,307th Composite Unit, Provisional. The unit history would remember as Merrill's Marauders. When they stepped off into the jungle in February 1944, They did so with 700 pack animals, and a mission that seemed suicidal on paper. A long-range penetration deep behind Japanese lines, cutting across the grain of the country's brutal topography. The men were a mix of jungle warfare volunteers and battle-hardened infantry, but few were horsemen. General Frank Merrill, looking at his motley crew of city boys and farm hands, famously quipped that he would rather make doughboys out of mule skinners than try to turn doughboys into mule skinners. But the army gave him doughboys, and the jungle gave them no choice but to learn. The education was immediate and unforgiving. In the Yukon Valley, the trails were often little more than game tracks widened by machete. During the February push, the Marauders encountered inclines so steep that the laws of physics seemed to turn against them. A mule, for all its sure-footedness, has a center of gravity that becomes treacherous under a 200-pound load. On the slick, clay-heavy slopes leading toward Wallobum, the animals simply could not find purchase. They would scramble, hooves striking sparks against hidden shale, eyes rolling in panic as they slid backward. It was here that the distinction between man and beast began to dissolve. The soldiers, already carrying their own 60-pound rucksacks, weapons, and ammunition, had to strip the packs from the mules. Men formed human chains, passing the heavy wooden crates of 75 ammunition and K-rations hand over hand up the muddy chutes. They hoisted the heavy Phillips cargo saddles onto their own shoulders, trudging up slopes on hands and knees, sweating alongside the animals. When a mule fell, it wasn't a piece of equipment that had broken. It was a teammate that was down. Men risked hernia and heart failure to get the animals back on their feet, wiping the mud from the mules' eyes with the same rags they used to clean their M1 Garands. They learned that a mule would work until it died, provided it was treated with a specific mix of firmness and respect. They learned to check the cinches for leeches, and to listen to the animals breathing in the heavy, humid night. But the true crucible of this partnership arrived in April 1944, at a remote hilltop village called Nhpumga. The siege that took place there remains one of the most harrowing chapters of the CBI theater, a moment where the logistical value of the mule collided violently with the reality of static warfare. The Marauders, specifically the 2nd Battalion, found themselves cut off and surrounded by a numerically superior Japanese force. They dug in on a narrow ridge, a defensive perimeter that was barely 400 yards long and 200 yards wide. Into this confined space were crammed the men, and approximately 200 mules. For 10 days, the Japanese subjected the ridge to a relentless barrage of artillery and mortar fire. The enemy gunners quickly realized that the mules were the unit's lifeline. Without them, the Marauders could not move their heavy weapons or evacuate their wounded if a breakout became possible. The corral became a kill zone. The shelling at Nhpumga was precise and devastating. Shrapnel tore through the bamboo and flesh indiscriminately. The mules, tethered in a depression in the ground that offered only marginal cover, had nowhere to run. They panicked, straining against their halters, their braying mixing with the screams of wounded men and the crump of incoming mortars. By the end of the siege, 75 of the 200 animals had been killed. The conditions inside the perimeter deteriorated into a nightmare. The heat of the Burmese April accelerated decomposition. The stench of the dead mules, bloated and rotting in the tropical sun, hung heavy over the foxholes, making the simple act of breathing a struggle for the exhausted soldiers. Unable to dispose of the bodies in the confined space, the Marauders were forced to endure the putrid atmosphere alongside the constant mortar fire, a grim testament to the brutality of the siege. If you would like more war stories from World War II, please like this video and subscribe to our channel.